So today is the second in a series of 4 webinars that we're running on the topic of community-led housing. So the first webinar was called Introducing Community-Led Housing, and we held that on the 12th of February. There's a recording of that available as well on our housing agency YouTube channel, for anyone that wants to go back and watch that. And then today we will be talking about community-led housing as affordable housing, and we have 3 speakers who I will be introducing you to shortly. And then in March, we have a further 2 sessions planned. The first one is community-led housing for age-friendly living, and that will be on the 11th. And then the 4th session will be state support for community-led housing, and that's going to take place on the 26th of March. That one is going to be a slightly longer session because it will also include a panel discussion as well as some presentations. And overall, the goal of our webinar series is really to raise awareness of community-led housing in Ireland, to look and learn from international examples of this in operation, and then also to reflect on what this means for community-led housing in Ireland. And I guess to reflect that for each of our sessions, we have an international speaker, and then we have speakers who are there to provide the sort of context and background to community-led housing in Ireland. So with that said, I'd like to introduce our speakers for today. So we're very pleased to be having 3 speakers, and we're going to start off with Eduard Cabré-Romans, who is an international relations consultant at the Barcelona Municipal Institute for Housing and Renovation. He is going to present around housing in Barcelona and the wider region, and also the cooperative model that they have in operation there. And then we're going to go on to have a joint presentation from Eve Olney and Alva Cunningham, who are both members of the Cork Community Land Trust. So we'll be hearing from them after we've heard from Eduard. But for now, I'll hand over to Eduard, who is going to present first. And also just a note to say that there is a good bit of time set aside for question and answer at the end of the session. So please do put all of your questions into the Q&A function, and that's at the bottom of your screen. And we can then direct those to the speakers at the end of the presentations. So I will stop sharing now. And Eduard, if you'd like to share your slides.
Okay, can you hear me all right?
Yeah, all good.
Great. All right, so I'll get started. My name is Eduard, again, Eduard Cabré, coming from the Municipal Institute for Housing and Renovation at the City of Barcelona. It's a pleasure to be here and to share our knowledge as well as some concerns and practices with colleagues from other countries. So I'm happy to be here. I'm going to be presenting, let me see if I can move. Yeah. I'm going to be, first of all, telling you a little bit about the housing context in Barcelona before getting into the meat of the presentation. Barcelona and Spain as a country are amongst the places in Europe with the smallest social rental housing stock. This is, of course, the result of housing policies over the years, and specifically the result of policies that were very focused on supporting housing homeownership for housing, homeownership opportunities for low-income households as well. And as a result of this policy, as of today, we have less than 2% of social rental housing. The other consequence of this policy is that we moved from being a country where almost 50% of people lived in rentals to now being one of the countries with the highest homeownership rate. And this is also the case for the city of Barcelona, even though we are the municipality in Spain with the highest share of rental housing. Currently at above 40% of our population lives in rental. We believe this is a problem, mainly because after the global financial crisis of 2008, people were very much left without an option to access home ownership, mainly because mortgages became very restrictive. and therefore all of the demand for housing moved only to the rental housing sector. And as a result of that increasing demand, we've seen a steep increase in rental prices, as you can tell from the graph on the top of the screen. And very troubling, a lot of these renters are experiencing very harsh economic situations, with now more than 44% of households who live in rentals in the city spending more than 40% of their income in housing, which is very high. I'm sure if you compare it to Irish indicators, it's also very hard to understand how much people can live in those circumstances. So the other challenge that we're facing is that we are not able to deliver the number of affordable housing units that we should be aiming for. We, of course, have set ourselves certain goals of how many affordable units are needed every year to respond to the housing needs that the city has. But we are only delivering around 300 to 400 units a year, compared to the more than 1,000 units that we were delivering before the global financial crisis. This is, of course, very low level of production, and the city is amongst the highest providers of affordable housing. And even so, we're not able to deliver the number of units that we hope for. The city, let me just skip this slide for a sec. The city set for itself certain goals. Back in 2016, we passed a 10-year housing plan. And so far, we've been able to deliver more than 6,600 affordable housing units. These includes not only new construction, but also the acquisition of existing private housing units that were either vacant or were at risk of being gentrified and people being foreclosed on. We were able to acquire some of those units, and we also have some programs to mobilize temporarily some of the privately owned housing units to join affordable housing programs run by the city or some of its social partners. And so through all of these different programs, we are able to provide for affordable housing programs. And now I'm going to go back to the previous slide, which accounts for the different types of collaborations that we set. So we, of course, deliver some units through public programs exclusively. There are some private providers that also provide some affordable housing by themselves. And then we have different types of collaborations between the city and nonprofit as well as limited profit partners to deliver some of those units. And we not only do it in new construction, but also through acquisition and renovation of existing housing units. And today I'm going to be focusing on this very small share of new construction, which is cooperative housing, of which we have already delivered more than 120 units. And we are in the process of building a lot more. So now really going into the community-led housing world in Barcelona. Before I really go deep into this, just a quick note on the legal context for housing more generally in the city. So the first thing to say is that housing as a competence is a shared competence between the three levels of government that operate in Barcelona. The national level, which is responsible for setting baseline legal obligations and regulations for the housing generally. Also, and very specifically on the rental housing stock, the national level is responsible for setting the general legislation on rental housing, and also is responsible for budget allocations for other levels of government. So most of the funding for housing policies comes from the national level. Then the regional level is really the one responsible for housing policies and setting housing goals and plans. And it's also responsible for urban planning and land management both at the territorial level as well as for approving local housing plans and town planning. And then the local level is responsible for proposing as well as implementing urban planning and managing urban planning, and also building licenses. Barcelona is somewhat of an exception on this because as a major city, we have some prerogatives and we can go beyond the competences that are allocated for other local governments, and we partner a lot more with the other two levels of government. But generally speaking, this is the overall share of competences between the three levels of government. Now, another thing that is also relevant for today's discussion is how cooperative housing, which is our main community-led type of housing, is regulated in the law. Cooperative housing appears in the housing law in Catalonia, the region in which Barcelona is. This law was approved in 2007, and it recognizes cooperative housing as a type of right of use housing, and also as a type of affordable housing, which means that regardless of whether this cooperative housing is built as affordable housing as the way it's defined in the law, because it provides housing for its own members, it needs to provide it as at cost in a way. So the prices are essentially capped by construction costs, regardless of the fact that these could also operate as affordable housing as defined in the law. And I'm gonna tell you a little bit more about this later on. On top of this, cooperative housing also appears in the cooperatives law in Catalonia of 2015, and it also includes a reference to the right of use cooperative housing typology, which is different from the traditional cooperative housing that operated in Spain over the years, which was essentially a way to develop homeownership housing for cooperative members. And so in that model, cooperatives would develop the housing and then disappear as its members would become homeowners of the units, compared to this right of use cooperative housing typology, which essentially develops the housing and stays in place as the manager of the units over time. Okay, so once we have this context, this legal context, of course, things didn't happen just out of the blue. In Barcelona, there was community organizing that had been discussing about the possibility of promoting cooperative and community-led housing in the city. Of course, these legal arrangements gave them some basis for developing the concept, as well as specific proposals on how this housing could take place. And so back in 2015, some especially local groups and community groups were beginning to organize around specific demands for the city to provide them with plots of land or vacant buildings that they could use for their first cooperative projects. And so this community organizing and the social entities that were either created or transformed by these proposals were in a way the necessary ingredients for this movement and this type of housing to emerge. The first phase that we consider when we present our own community-led housing in the city initiated when in 2014 and 2015, the city signed two bilateral agreements with two cooperative groups to develop the first community-led housing projects in the city. These two bilateral agreements were signed as pilot projects. One of them was in new construction. The other one was the renovation of an existing building. The existing building has 5 units. The new construction today has 28 units. These are the pictures you see are from these two projects. And so what the bilateral agreement said, in essence, was that the city was eager to provide a long-term lease on public land or a public building for 75 years, with an extension then for up to 90 years. And it defined the conditions for the model, which were essentially that the cooperative needed to be a zero equity cooperative based on this right of use model that the law already recognized. That these joint ownership of the building operated also at the level of the cooperative, so that the cooperative needed to remain as the main manager of the building over time, and then could grant individual right of use of the housing units to its members. So in a way, the city remained in contact with the cooperative, and then the cooperative would sign these right of use agreements with its members that would then organize internally through different governance mechanisms to manage and run the building on the daily basis. And the other key idea was that because we were providing public land and buildings, the units themselves needed to fulfill all of the affordable housing obligations that operate in other types of projects. That means that the people living in these units needed to comply with income limits, as well as other criteria, such as not owning any other property. And at the same time, they needed to be members of the cooperative, which was, of course, the condition for them to be able to get allocated one of the units. The other aspect that I think is very relevant and is in a way linked to the model is that the cooperatives themselves were very interested in introducing very innovative construction methods. For example, using timber and also very low carbon construction methods in the renovation process of the existing building, as well as very innovative financing tools that were not in place in the city largely before these two projects were put in place. So one of these projects is La Borda, which has been very much, it's been very famous and awarded for different reasons. One of the reasons is this innovative construction method using timber. Also the fact that they used a modular typology of the units that allows for a very flexible use of the units, in which some of the bedrooms can be connected to the apartments on both sides of the unit or the bedroom, giving it flexibility over time to adapt depending on the residents' needs. And also the financing was very innovative and brought together many different income streams, both from public subsidies to loans, as well as participatory bonds that people would buy in exchange for a small return on the investment. So yeah, the idea being that they really needed to resource to all of the different options at their disposal, and these, of course, dictated how the sector evolved and how other projects adopted some of these best practices. The second phase for the deployment of the model in Barcelona was 2 rounds of competitive public land tenders. So in this case, we were not pioneering, we were not trying new pilot projects, but we were actually looking to scale the model. And so the city put forth different plots of land through these competitive land tenders. The essence of the model was exactly the same, the long-term lease, the definition of the cooperative housing model, and this was really key to scale up. And these 2 land tenders really allowed the sector to grow and to in a way show that they had a capability to build more projects. After these second phase, we went into a third phase, which was really, I believe, the articulation of something larger. In this case, we signed a framework agreement both with the cooperative housing sector as well as the nonprofit rental housing sector to provide land in bulk to deliver more than 1,000 units in 10 years. The essence of the model, again, is very similar: long-term lease on municipal land, in this case, for both cooperative as well as rental housing. We added a municipal returnable subsidy for the construction of the units, which was also supportive for them to finance construction, as well as to target lower income groups. So, on top of providing affordable housing, they were able to also include some units that were set aside for lower income groups. The city also negotiated with the sector a framework agreement with the regional and national public financing entities to access low interest finance for some of these projects. And overall, this framework was set with the end goal of working towards setting a community land trust. The community land trust model is not something that we know of. Generally, it's not common in Spain. People are not familiar with it, but given the characteristics of this framework agreement, which is, long-term lease on public land in this case, but essentially the separation between ownership of the land and the construction, the fact that we're looking at permanent affordability, and also the involvement of residents in the design, implementation, and then management of the building, especially in the cooperative housing sector, gave us the impression that we were, in a way, already working towards a community land trust model, and this is what we are also working towards in the future. For the land allocation in this framework agreement model, what we do is we provide public land in bulk, and we ask the different providers to make a proposal to the city for the allocation of the plots. They do that separately, the cooperatives on one side, the rental housing on the other side. They discuss it internally amongst the entities in the sector, and then they submit a proposal to the city, which the city can then accept or deny. This, in a way, negotiated system has allowed for a lot more flexibility. It has also allowed the sector to have or to build long-term planning on how they work on their projects, so that they know that maybe one or another project might not come in the short term, but they can expect it to come later on, and this gives them time to plan and to build capacity. And this has also allowed the city to be faster, because we don't need to go through competitive tenders, which are very long, which have also proven to be somewhat conflictual, because sometimes people complain that they don't have either time, they don't have the resources to compete. They also don't want to compete amongst themselves because it's not in their nature to compete, because we're talking about communities, we're talking about groups that are not used to competing in this type of public tenders. So in a way, this model have allowed us to keep a formal process and at the same time give them time and space to find solutions that work to everyone, in essence. Here you have a map of all of the different projects and where they are located in the city. We try to balance location and also to locate cooperative housing projects with other types of affordable housing, that being rental housing, senior housing, and other typologies. This is, of course, both the units that are already in use, the ones that are in construction, and a lot of them that are still in the process of the land being allocated. So, we're only at around 120 units in use, another 200 to 300 units in different stages of construction, then the rest, which are now in the process of the land being allocated. I always talk about land, but a lot of these projects are actually renovation of existing buildings, which can be just the retrofitting of an existing building, or actually a densification of existing structures that were left vacant for some reason. I must say that a lot of the buildings that have tenants in them usually are allocated to social rental housing providers that then can take on the management and the renters themselves. Whereas the buildings that are vacant and can be densified or converted are usually allocated to cooperative providers because they already have the people that need to be allocated to or need to move on into these units. So of course it makes sense for them to take on vacant property and not property that already has tenants in it. And this is for Barcelona. I'm going to briefly tell you about the rest of Catalonia, because this is of course not a movement that is limited to the municipality of Barcelona, but actually across Catalonia we're seeing cooperative housing projects, a lot of them on public land, but a lot of them also in privately owned land that cooperatives can either buy or they get a long-term lease on. The fact that property prices are lower in more rural settings allows cooperatives to have access to the full ownership of the land in many instances compared to much more denser and also more expensive urban settings. And also new construction and renovation of existing building operate in different contexts. I want to bring your attention to one project which I think is very interesting, which is the renovation of a hotel, of a vacant hotel in a very touristy area. You see a picture of it at the bottom of the screen, and I believe this is interesting because this means that we're not only looking at residential property necessarily, we also have community-led housing projects in potentially in vacant offices, in this case in a hotel, but also in other types of industrial vacant property and other urban regeneration projects that can be interesting not only from a housing perspective, but also from a community development perspective. Another aspect that I think is interesting is to realize that when cooperative housing and community-led housing projects were done without any public support, all of the housing that was delivered, which was not a lot of it, was non-affordable housing. That doesn't mean that it wasn't really affordable, but it was not under the affordable housing regulation that operates for affordable housing in Catalonia, which is this VPO. But once municipalities, especially and the regional government afterwards, started providing support, mainly by providing public land, but also some subsidy and also setting the regulation for these community-led projects to operate, the sector really started to scale. And this scaling was significant from a quantitative perspective, but also from a qualitative perspective, because it allowed these projects to emerge in these very expensive markets, such as Barcelona, which would not have been possible in another context.
Edward, sorry to interrupt, but just to let you know that we've got a couple of seconds left. Perfect.
Great. Last slide. I just wanted to share this diagram because I think it gives you quite an image of the complexity of what I've been telling you about. Of course, I'm talking from the perspective of a municipality, but when we talk about the projects themselves, we need to look at a lot more aspects. And so La Dinamo, which is a foundation that supports community-led housing projects, created this diagram which shows how groups need to start organizing from the very beginning, setting the basis for their project, both from a social perspective as well as from a housing perspective, then move on to looking for land and building opportunities, then engaging with municipalities to try to get their support, and all the way to actually building the project, managing the project, and planning for the long-term management and operation of the project. So just this image to summarize how this is operating in Barcelona. Thank you very much.
That's great. Thank you very much, Edward. It's brilliant to hear about how things have developed from 2007, especially about how it's been scaled up as well. I'm sure that gives lots of people food for thought. We're going to move on now to hear about what's going on in Ireland. So we have Eve Olney, who is a socially engaged creative producer and is also on the steering committee of Cork Community Land Trust. And then we have Alva Cunningham, who is also on the steering committee of Cork Community Land Trust and is also a socially engaged architect. So if you guys want to start sharing your slides, and looking forward to hearing about what's going on in Cork.
Thanks, Joanna. And thanks to the Housing Agency as well for inviting Cork Community Land Trust to talk today. Myself and Alva are representing what are 6 members of the steering group that have set up the Cork Community Land Trust. So I'm just going to briefly, to begin by briefly describing what a community land trust is, for those who may not be familiar with the model. So community land trusts are non-profit, democratically run organizations that give communities control over local land and buildings that in turn provide a means to support affordable housing and shared social or cultural community spaces or whatever other resources the community might require. And they emerged in the US in the 1960s as part of the civil rights movement and have come to prominence in America, Britain, and Europe as a means of addressing housing affordability through a community-led approach. And then just to break it down in a very kind of simple way of what each term stands for. So the concept of community in the CLT typically includes homeowners or tenants, as well as the broader community members and also those who have a public interest in CLTs. So all are able to become members of the Community Land Trust. In terms of land, CLTs work on the basis of separating the value of the land from the building or property. So the land is owned collectively by the CLT in a trust, and residents then might buy or rent the buildings, or if it's shared space, it might be run by a cooperative. So this makes it then affordable in perpetuity. And then finally, in relation to trust, CLTs are legally committed to never selling the land. So therefore, homes within the trust are kept permanently affordable. And Alva will talk into that in more detail later. So the Community Land Trust then typically represents a particular geographic area and is open for membership to anyone living or working in the area. A CLT is therefore then an organization of and for the community. Again, land trusts are typically founded on an ethos of inclusion, collaboration, co-creation, and diversity. So an essential aspect of the CLT is that communities are involved from the beginning in decisions about what is needed and what should be provided by the CLT. So CLTs often then use a tripartite governance structure, and this means basically that 1/3 of the board of the CLT are elected by the community members. So again, that would be anyone living or working in the CLT area. 1/3 are elected by those that live in CLT homes. So the homeowners, the tenants, are those the users of the collective spaces or community spaces. And 1/3 are elected by civil society stakeholders such as the local council and NGOs with expertise in housing. So then Cork Community Land Trust was initiated through a series of public assemblies events in Cork City between January 2021 and May 22, of which then the steering committee was formed. And we've been working on establishing the CLT model in Ireland ever since then through various community engagements, events, as well as a pilot project. And we've recently become a legal entity as a non-profit CLG. So in tandem to establishing then affordable homes, a central component to the Cork Community Land Trust model involves a very focused and critical exploration and understanding of how we might build resilient community structures. So we draw from our own ongoing research and training in this field in developing methodological approaches to community building through various methods of, again, community engagements across Cork City. We are also now in our second year within a EU Interreg Upcycling Trust project. So the timeframe for that project spans between 2023 to 2028. And we are part of a consortium, Northwestern European CLTs, that include the cities of Brussels, Ghent, Rennes, Lille, and ourselves in Cork. And the main objective of this project is to research and develop and deliver an affordable housing pilot project through different circular renovation strategies. So out of then the 5 pilot locations, Cork is the only one without an existing CLT. So we're the only ones basically piloting the implementation of a CLT. So therefore kind of creating the financial, legal and technical frameworks to enable Community Land Trust to become a significant actor in addressing the housing crisis in Ireland in an ecologically sound and community-led way. So for this particular project, we're working in partnership with Cork City Council to deliver a pilot demonstrator project within that timeframe. And so therefore this also then addresses vacancy and dereliction in the city. Whereas the other 4 pilot locations who, as I said, have existing CLTs are diversifying their approaches and methods to concretely include circularity, renovation, as opposed to new builds. So the fact that we're all at different stages of development also enables a very significant and sizable knowledge transfer for all those involved, which is extremely valuable. And I'll just pass over to Alva now. Thanks.
You can hear me, can you? So to return to the definition of a community land trust and what forms this democratic non-profit organization's mission or objectives, aside from being informed by the priority of delivering affordable homes, it's concerned very much with community agendas and priorities which are set at a local level. And in our context in Cork, this is very much focused towards tackling vacancy and dereliction and reading and taking into account the principles of the circular economy in doing so. When we look at our local context, so as Eve mentioned, we're involved in this Interreg Northwest European project. In Cork City, we have very high rates of vacancy and dereliction in our city centre, right in the heart of the city at 12.1%, and in Shandon Fairhill with 13%. The city centre, the majority of the residential rental units, they're privately rented. So again, a correlation there with Eduard's presentation from Barcelona. We see anything from 60% through to 73% of the properties available are being rented in private rental settings. The number of households that do not qualify for a mortgage and cannot afford private rental was identified by Cork County and City Council in their draft joint housing strategy for 22 through 28 as being 3,492 households. Then we have 72% of apartments in the city centre currently achieving an energy rating of C or lower. So this speaking to the quality of the built fabric currently in use. Then when we look at the median price of sales, dwelling purchase, we have ranges of 240,000 through to 270,000 within central south and north city centre locations. And that is before any renovation cost or any built fabric improvement costs are taken into account. Average rents in Cork City Centre, then, just to look at this pressurised condition within which our project sits, looking at Q4 2016 and comparing it with Q4 2024 in the Daft rental price reports, we see a steep rise from just over €1,000 to nearly €2,100 across that 8-year timeline, with a year-on-year increase of 10% projected to continue for the foreseeable. So when we compare that then with disposable household incomes, and what's listed here on screen is actually the gross incomes in households in the central areas, it greatly exceeds the 35% of disposable household income that we would see, or that is perceived to be financially viable for renters, or to be allocated towards rental costs. So returning to something that Eve mentioned in the 3 foundational principles of the Community Land Trust, that of land and property and its division, this is something that of course is conceptual rather than literal. So when we think about that, it's removing the speculative condition or the speculative pressures of the land and its location. Again, referring back to Barcelona, these highly speculative profiteering locations we see because of proximity perhaps to city centres in highly dense areas. In our instance in Ireland, even in lower dense city centres across our cities. When we look at that then within the legal structure in the context in Ireland, the division of land from property is not something that can literally occur. So we look at the naming of the CLT within the titles or the deeds of properties where we have individual homes, or we engage in the typical ways that you would have in a multi-unit apartment complex dwelling. The individual homes can be rented or owned, with the shared space or the building as a whole being held by the Community Land Trust. So this legal structure or mechanism ensuring that affordability is locked in to resale values or to rental markets, again, removing the speculative conditions observed in private markets. Then when we come to this concept of renovation and tackling dereliction and vacancy, across Ireland, our cities, our towns and our villages, we witness the continued and long-term deterioration of built fabric and depleting finances. So whether that be lack of access to finance through mortgage or loans, or individual private or public access to finance, it kind of feels like this vicious loop, which currently is being people are struggling to meet. So when we consider the introduction of the CLT mechanism, unlocking the value of the land, therefore providing financial investment into the homeowner, that in turn allowing for the improvements of the built fabric and the home renovation, and in parallel securing this accessibility or this affordability in perpetuity. So the locking of the land within the CLT legal mechanism being the support mechanism through which the home is renovated, and then in turn becoming part of this ecosystem of affordable and quality built fabric across the CLT and its membership. Again, just to return to this concept of perpetuity, whether it is locked in through affordable lease or affordable sale, there's a clause within the sale, and there is a calculator used to allow and to acknowledge that inflation must be taken into account, but not the pressures or the demands driven at the financial spikes that we see at currently unfolding, or at times of financial crisis or demand exceeding supply within markets. So this is something that repeatedly at the initial point of renovation or building in new build projects, but in our instance through the Upcycling Trust project, when the property is renovated, the land and this legal mechanism locking affordability, not just for the first household or homeowner or home renter, but recurringly and repeatedly in perpetuity for generations. So then just looking at the legal context, so our Affordable Housing Act 2021 recognised community land trusts as one of the mechanisms through which democratic community-led housing could provide affordable housing in Ireland. But we still face a series of roadblocks. And again, I think this is perhaps where we can go to more extensively in the Q&A, but there is a need for the Affordable Housing Act to be regulated through implementation. We are currently carrying out this pilot in partnership with Cork City Council, but these pilots need to be tested and they need to be troubleshooted in order to provide scalable and more sustainable long-term models, implementation structures, legal, technical and financial as they are. There's a feasibility stage grant that a need that needs to be addressed with support to allow community groups or local partnerships that form not only in Cork City but across the country to be able to assess the feasibility of projects as they are identified in meeting the needs of local communities. There's a need to readdress access to affordable finance. There's most definitely a viability gap which is being witnessed across the public, private and this emerging CLT structure, then there's an inherent need to recognize not only the immediate impact of this model, but the long-term impact. So the ongoing and repeated and long-term affordability that the model can provide. And finally, just a national recognition is required that this model is not seen to replace, but indeed to support and add to the existing public and private models that are being used to deliver housing in this country. So we leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's great to hear about sort of a practical example of this happening at the moment. I can see that we've got quite a few questions already coming up in the Q&A. So please, to all the attendees, feel free to keep posting them into the chat function or the Q&A. I thought I might start with one which is around early stage funding and the fact that that is always a challenge here and an issue in Ireland. So for example, for pre-planning costs. So the question is, how is that sourced in Barcelona? But it might also be interesting to then hear how that experience is for Eve and Alba at the moment, who are sort of going through that.
Yeah, so that's definitely the case also in our context, and it was especially at the beginning when there wasn't a clear expectation that these community-led projects would or could potentially work out. And so back at the time, I think that there were some foundations and some community groups that had some resources that they decided to invest in these ideas. And I think you always need that to begin with. You need private individuals and groups and entities that are willing to risk and to work on developing this as a financiable and a workable concept. At the end of the day, you need someone that works on it. But then very quickly, the city in Barcelona, even before providing this land, did provide some support through its social and solidarity economy funds and support measures. So in a way, these community-led housing groups were seen as any other type of nonprofit group that is trying to work towards an economy that serves the greater good and so on and so forth. And so there were resources there that were potentially or could potentially be allocated to these type of groups. And I know that some cooperative groups did access some of those funds for their initial expenditures. And then another thing that I wanted to mention, which I think is a key learning from, especially from the public land tenders that we did back in 2016, which is that in the first public land tender, we required cooperatives to submit both the social project, so to speak, and the description of their project and so on, and also the architectural project, which meant that they needed to take on a very expensive part of the project from the very beginning, even without having assurances that they would be allocated that plot of land. And then for the second public land tender, what we did at their proposal was to set a two-tier process. In the first round, people only needed to submit the very basic kind of social project, as well as information that we would assess to make sure that they complied with the formal kind of requirements that were needed in terms of having the appropriate type of professional advice, the appropriate standing in economic standing and other aspects, but we didn't require them to submit the project, the basic architectural project yet, until they were pre-selected for the second phase of the procurement. And so we would pre-select 3 projects in the first part, and then the 3 best would go on to the second part, and they would get a stipend of 3,000 euros to work on their architectural proposals. So in a way, by doing that, we were at least providing some funding for the groups that didn't have any funding to work on their architectural projects. And I think that did make a difference, because it gave some, especially the smallest and weakest groups, some funding to work on their proposals.
Great, thanks. I might just move on to another question that we've had through that I think would be useful for us to answer. So we had a question about at what stage is Cork Community Land Trust at the moment? So at what stage is the pilot, and what are your sort of planned next steps and the next things that you're going to be doing?
So we're currently, as Eve said, just beginning year 2 of the project. We're still finalizing a site. So when we say site, it's a building, built fabric for renovation. We're identifying that with Cork City Council at present. And we're also in discussions with various different lending institutions, national, like government level departments, and then the local authority itself. So across all of these, and I think that comes back to this question around financing, we're assessing the different modes and means through which this project will come into being. We're also exploring philanthropic lending and donation-based routes. So we're still at these initial stages of working out the number one, the legal, the technical mechanisms through which the project will be delivered, but also the financial and actually the end use. Is it a rental or a for sale route that we will go down? I suppose the key advantage that we find ourselves in is that in parallel to the stage that we are at here in Ireland and in Cork City, we have partners in Brussels who are currently at the implementation stage, providing funding for private apartment homeowners and their renovation in Brussels. In Ghent, they're at a similar stage to us in acquiring the site or the buildings which will be renovated. And then we have two very different contexts in Lille and Rennes, where the local authorities are the kind of the lead partner in the Community Land Trust or OFS models that they have in France. And they are at the stage of renovating multi-unit developments. So in Cork, very much still at this feasibility and development stage, because as Eve mentioned, we are not only instigating this renovation model, but also developing this kind of second phase of incorporation for the Community Land Trust itself.
And how have you found so far sort of working with the different funding institutions and so on? Is there recognition and understanding of what community land trusts are? Like how has that process been for you?
It's early doors, so still it's something that people are very much open and willing to meet us with, but until we have implemented it, it won't be factually true nor correct to say that that's recognized. I think that the need for this pilot implementation is really crucial. There are groups the country over, and I see some names popping up there in the chat box and in the participant list, who are working at this across the country in different locations. But I suppose we hope that with the support of Cork City Council, we can validate through this pilot project, we can validate the delivery mechanisms through which this can be scaled. So we do see that perhaps there will be a requirement for maybe additional philanthropic approach in this first pilot project, which would then act as the justification through which that willingness or opening could then occur.
Yeah. Oh, very interesting. It would be sort of interesting to track how that develops now I'm sure there'll be lots of people wanting to hear updates from you both. There's another question here that I think it would be interesting for both, which is how are universal design homes being considered within the Community Land Trust model? So I wonder if that's something that's already in practice in Barcelona, and what Eve and Alva, what you think about that in Ireland.
You go first.
Yeah, I think that what's fundamental or foundational to a community land trust is that you are addressing the needs identified within the local community. So at any stage, it is about inclusion of all members present. So if there is a need for, like, I suppose, universal design plus conditions to be addressed based on the needs of a member of the organization, they become a priority through shared agreement. in general, it would always be to upkeep, like to exceed standards in quality and delivery. So I think that's inherent. So we don't have a built example, so I can't give an explicit example, but that I do think that's implicit in the activities of a community land trust, and putting community-led needs and priorities at the forefront. Something that you see across CLTs, and CLTs, if for anyone who's familiar, no two CLTs are the same, but it's always addressing needs. So it might be something which I know is very prevalent in Ireland, a need to address downsizing in retirement. Others, like family units, where it's maybe a single parent family unit, then you're looking for a very different condition to that of a family which needs perhaps a 4-bedroomed home. Then if we bring in concepts of universal design, again, which I know is widely discussed in Ireland, perhaps not so widely implemented, but most definitely people are striving to achieve it, is that we always aim for more than the bare minimum regulatory standards require in order to make buildings accessible for as many needs as possible. Because at a recent universal design talk that I attended, it's very clear that meeting the needs of one person can prevent or kind of reduce the kind of meeting the needs of another. So it's continuously a measured and balanced approach taken based on the needs presented. I hope that answers the question. If there's a qualified question wanted, I'm happy to answer it.
That's very helpful. Thank you. Yeah, Edward, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I would just add, I mean, very similar in the case of Barcelona, of course, when people are designing and building their own housing and they're involved in the design phase, they do give a lot of importance to issues such as accessibility and other aspects of making not only the units, but also the common areas very inviting and very inclusive in every aspect. What I would add also is that we also work in terms of including other social groups in the projects, and cooperatives are very conscious of the fact that in many cases they do attract disproportionately people who have higher education and who are have a lot of social capital. They are very much linked to the context they find themselves in. But we also want them to include people who are not as well connected in a way. And so they do sometimes set aside some units that they then offer to foundations or nonprofits that work with specific groups, that then use those units for housing for their own people. So for example, we have some cooperatives that have units set aside for refugees or for youth that have been receiving public support, and once they come of age, they are left on their own, but they don't have any social networks to resource to. So in a way, this gives them an opportunity as well. So I think it's important to also look at inclusiveness from this perspective of opening up not only to the communities, but also the communities to the wider city and region.
Great, thank you. I can see that we're actually out of time already, so that hour has flown by. I just wanted to take a moment to say thank you to Eve, Alva, and Edward. It's been really great to hear sort of what's happening currently in Cork, and also all the work that you're doing in Barcelona. Hopefully there'll be more discussions about this in the future. And we also do have 2 more sessions in this series to come. So I think a link to register for those will be posted in the chat here, and it's also available on the Housing Agency's website. But yeah, I just want to say thanks again to all the attendees, to the speakers, and also to the team here at the Housing Agency who have been supporting behind the scenes with setting up all these webinars. It's very much appreciated, and we will hopefully see you at the next session on the 11th of March.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.